Hey everybody, what's up? Chad Wesley Smith here for Juggernaut Training Systems and Juggernaut AI, joined by multiple-time national champion Marisa Inda. And today we're going to be talking to you about how to train your conventional deadlift so you can get as strong as possible, stay healthy, all the good stuff, build muscle, everything in between. So we're going to be talking about key technical points, some common mistakes we see people making in their deadlift training, and then some notes on training frequency and different exercises that can help you improve your deadlift. So the first key technical point that we're going to be talking about is your setup and hinging down to the bar. So too many lifters, they tend to squat down to the bar thinking that that's going to help them use their legs better, but they end up lacking hamstring tension, their hips rise relatively fast compared to their shoulders, and they lose the hip hinge aspect of the deadlift. So if this is something that you struggle with, suggest that you try and RDL down to the bar to get a good setup position. And maybe you don't do this all the time, but until you know what the good position feels like, this is a good way to do it. So Marisa's initiating by hinging back at the hips, feeling tension in her hamstrings. Depending on your mobility, you probably get down to where you can maybe just like brush the bar with your fingers and then grab the bar and leverage yourself, use the weight of the bar to pull yourself down the rest of the way. So as Marisa RDLs into position, setting hips back, long tension in the hamstrings, then she uses the bar to pull herself down into position. Her hips are slightly higher than her knees. Unless you have a very unique build, this is almost always going to be true. Your hips are going to be higher than your knees in the start of the deadlift. Depending on limb length and proportion, will determine how much forward knee movement you have, but we want to try and minimize that as much as possible. Marisa pushes her butt back. She's doing an RDL, hinges down in position, uses the bar to leverage herself down into a great start position with a lot of hamstring tension. The next key technical point we're going to address is about creating tension throughout your torso. To create this strong, rigid torso, the cue that we like to use is to protect your armpits. This cue came to mind for me. I've been given this cue at seminars for over 10 years because when I was a little kid, fat little giant-headed, blonde curly hair Westlos, my older brothers would like tickle me in my armpits and until I fart a lot or until I piss my pants or something. So I had to learn how to protect my armpits, and to do that, it's the feeling of squeezing your triceps against your lats. So as Marisa gets set in the deadlift here, if she fails to protect her armpits and I can get in there, all right, you can see that the bar is going to drift away from her, but she does a good job protecting her armpits. I can't get in there, and now she's got a rigid torso, so everything's going to rise together and the bar is going to stay close to her body throughout the pull. All right, so the next aspect of deadlift technique that we want to talk about is as you initiate the lift, how we should do that. Are you pulling with your hips? Are you pulling with your back? And the cue that we like to use for this is to push the floor away. So as Marisa gets in that great hinge setup position, protecting her armpits, now she's going to initiate this lift by pushing her feet straight down into the floor. Another good way to think of this is if you were to have a string attached to the top of your head, that string is pulling you up towards the ceiling. So that's going to help us have our shoulders and hips raise at the same rate. We want to avoid the hips raising early, kind of getting question marked over, the bar drifting away, losing some of that upper back tension. But all of these ideas, hinge into position or RDL into position, protect your armpits, and then push the floor away, are going to work together for a good sequence in the deadlift. That's going to bring us to our final key technical point, which is to have an early lockout. So if we've done the first three things well, now we can initiate the deadlift lockout in our mind when the bar reaches the bottom of your knee. And I say that when it reaches the bottom of your knee rather than the top of your knee, because if it's already at the top of your knee, the time it's going to take for you to think, lock out your brain to send that to your body and you to execute it is going to make it happen a little bit too late. So as Marisa pulls the bar to the bottom of her knee, now she thinks about flexing her glutes, driving her hips forward to meet the bar at its lowest point. So she's doing this with long, relaxed arms, engaged lats, and having that very compact, efficient lockout. So if Marisa was to wait too long to initiate her lockout, a lot of times that gets an emphasis of leaning back. And with that, we can even have an unlocking of the knees. So you lock out and then you unlock, and that's going to end up getting you red lights at the meet. So we want to have this compact, efficient lockout by cueing ourselves to have an early lockout. Okay, now we're going to talk about some common mistakes we see with deadlift technique. And one that really stands out is having a stance or grip that is too wide for your body. And this might be because you've been watching a lot of really strong, professional strongman, world's strongest man competitors deadlift like Eddie Hall and Brian Shaw. And you're like, wow, look at those guys' stance. They're so strong in the deadlift. I should have a stance and grip like them. But you're forgetting in that you're not 6'8", 450 pounds. So you need to have a stance that fits your body well. So you can see as Marisa sets up for the deadlift, 5 foot, 115 pounds, feet are very close, seem very close together, but for her frame, they're not really that close. They're, inside hip width, so on the closer side of things. And wherever you set your feet, you want to have your grip as close outside your knees as possible. Because if Marisa was to grab really wide, now she's adding length to her deadlift. And if she was to grab too close, kind of like in front of her shins, now her shins and knees are pushing the bar away from her. So you can see where Marisa is set there, an appropriate width, stance, and grip for her size. And then as I come in here, slightly different body type. I like to set my foot width with my shin right on the line where the smooth meets the knurling, pulling myself down into position. And my grip just needs to be wide enough that I can get my chest through so I can have a nice smooth lockout. So if I was to have a real close grip or a real close stance, I might end up kind of blocked, not able to finish the lockout effectively. But for me, right there, everything can come through at the same time smooth. So another mistake that we often see with people in their deadlift training, and what happens to lead to a lot of back pain for people, is avoiding any kind of flexion in their training. So flexing your spine has become so vilified in the deadlift, but then you see some of the best deadlifters in the world who deadlift with a rounded back. So how can these two things exist together? So it's not that flexion in your spine is bad. We don't want your back angle to change during the deadlift, for you to go from flat to flexion or extension to flexion as you go. That we want to avoid. But your spine is meant to flex, extend, bend, twist, move in all of these athletic ways. But as lifters, we're so specific a lot of times towards, just neutral or extension that we have really little capacity to deal with spinal flexion. So giving yourself some exposure to spinal flexion in your warm-up, in your accessory exercises, through intentionally flexing your spine with something like a Jefferson curl or kneeling band crunches, flexion biased bird dog, different RDL variations. And you can learn more about these in a video called Exercises That Keep My Back Feeling Good. Those are all things that are definitely worthwhile for you to include in your deadlift. Know that you are not fragile, that your body is resilient, that if you are appropriately scaling the load and exposure to spinal flexion, that you can get really strong in that. It's not going to be you're not going to Jefferson curl as much as you can deadlift ever, but giving yourself some exposure and developing some capacity towards spinal flexion is going to help keep your back a lot healthier in the long run. Where avoiding flexion altogether in any part of your training is going to be a negative, because flexion's going to happen. It's going to happen either in a heavy deadlift in the course of a long, hard deadlift workout, or just in life. And if you have no capacity and no exposure to it, you're not going to be ready for it, and that's where pain is going to occur. But again, your back is meant to flex, it's meant to extend, it's meant to bend, it's meant to twist. You just need to be ready for it and trained for it, where you're appropriately loading and scaling those movements. And finally, some last closing notes on deadlift training. Most people are going to do best in the deadlift with 1 to 2 deadlift workouts a week. Of course, there are examples of really strong deadlifters who maybe only deadlift every other week, and other people who are doing great deadlifting 3 or even 4 times a week. But again, most lifters probably need to deadlift once or twice a week, with one of those sessions, or if you're only deadlifting once a week, every other week or every third week, that session being dedicated to your competition deadlift. And then the secondary session each week, or if you're only deadlifting once a week, you're on your alternating or undulating week schedule, so every 2 or 3 weeks, those other workouts being dedicated to addressing weak points. So if you're weak off the floor, the halting deadlift or a deficit deadlift from like 1 to 3 inch deficit is going to be appropriate. So if you're struggling in the mid-range of the deadlift, from just below the knee to just above the knee, RDLs are going to be great. Bent over rows can be great from that. And if you're struggling with the lockout portion of your deadlift, doing block pulls with the bar elevated on 2 to 4 inch blocks is going to be a great way to address that. You could also do something like a good morning or more directed glute training to complement your deadlift, like a barbell hip thrust. But 1 to 2 times a week for most people is going to be good. If you are just struggling kind of technically more than anything else, having a primary deadlift session and then a secondary session where you continue doing your competition deadlift but with a little bit lower intensity so you can think your way through the technique a bit more is going to be appropriate for you. So if you enjoyed this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and check out the Juggernaut AI app at juggernautai.app. You can get a 2-week free trial, over 5,000 reviews with a 4.9 star average. So lifters all over the world are using it to become the strongest versions of themselves. So whether you're young or old, small, big, beginner, intermediate, advanced, strong, weak, Juggernaut AI is going to create the smartest program for you.